Okay, welcome everyone. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. Yeah, so it's really great to see you all from here out and what a nice day. Nederlandse Economendag. Is the microphone working? So always has as one of the Tinbergen lecture, and we're super pleased that Professor this year. Now, what's really nice about this conference, and I think also rather unique in the world, is that this conference brings together people with many different. So of course we have a decent number of academic people working at universities. It's not working well. Hopefully this one is better. Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Eli. But then on top of that, there are also many people here, economists who work in policy, like at ministry, central bank. We have people working in business, we have journalists, and all these people get together here at the Nederlandse Economendag once a year to learn from each other, to discuss topical issues, and to exchange new insights. So, for the academic sessions, we always have a call for papers. Here we had a record number of submissions, and so we decided to increase the number of academic sessions, and also we decided to increase the number of posters that we had. I thought it was really nice to see that already this morning, I mean, the poster session was supposed to start at lunchtime, but already this morning people were presenting their poster, and actually Elian and we had to do some effort to get all the people in here. People were still discussing posters out there, very last minute. So I think the poster session has again been really great success. Now, a novel thing this year is that we also have a prize for the best poster. And to hand over this microphone to the chairperson of the jury, and that is Professor Marieke Knoef. And she is going to announce the winner of the best poster prize.
Thank you very much, Robert. Yeah, it was really a pleasure to see all these posters and to discuss them together with Hans van Kippens, Susanne Vissers and Jordi Meekes. We had a look at all these posters, and now they appear to be all very relevant, interesting, and I also want to mention them shortly because of the variety of topics that were involved. So there were posters about aging, posters about the tight labor market, about intergenerational mobility in socio-economic status, the labor income share, about businesses, how they respond to surveys, the expansion of higher education in Almere, electric vehicles and transportation behavior, the measurement of poverty, and also the protection of nature. So this shows the variety of topics, now all relevant and interesting that we have to choose between. And we said, now let's use some criteria. And what were the criteria that we used? Creativity, is the research innovative? But also, of course, quality of the research is important. The clarity of communication on the poster, but also the oral explanation that was in addition to that. And finally, also the conclusions and the policy implications. So do they follow logically from the results, and are they substantial? Now, it was very difficult. We used all the time that we had to come to a conclusion. And there we found that different papers demonstrated excellence in different criteria. So that makes it difficult to weigh these criteria. And then in the end we said, now today we bring policymakers and researchers together to interact with each other. So let's give the policy implications and the conclusions a little bit of extra weight, and then we came to a winner. And what is the winner? The winner is Marente Vlekke. Congratulations. Marente had a paper about the exact title. Yeah, it's very long. That we also mentioned when we wrote it down. The time-varying effects of macro versus sectoral labor market tightness on wage growth. Evidence from the Netherlands. Congratulations. There is more, also chocolate. But it will come to you.
Thanks, Marieke, and thanks, jury members. This is only possible thanks to the willingness of a lot of people to spend a substantial amount of time and energy. And this year's organizing committee is so large that I'm not going to read out loud all their names, but we have a really nice mosaic that you can see here. And since they did so much work, I do want to invite them to come to the front. Big applause, please, from the audience. Yeah, so as you can see, we have a great team here of bright young economists. The preparations for this conference already started in January with some drinks, also with the previous committee, right? And some of you actually were also on the committee, right? So that's also really nice. And well, this year's edition has again been great, and we would like to express our gratitude with a small present, and we are going to hand that out to you right now. So maybe one more applause for this great committee. Okay. Yeah. Whoa. Okay. Then it's time for the Tinbergen lecture. We are extremely pleased to have Professor Stefanie Stantcheva to give the Tinbergen lecture. Stefanie Stantcheva is professor of economics at Harvard. And she's also the founder and the director of the Social Economics. In 2018, she was named by the magazine one of the best young economists of the decade. This year, 2025, she was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal, which is the annual award by the American Economic Association to the economist under the age of 40 who made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. Stantcheva grew up in France. For her bachelor studies, she moved to the UK. There she obtained a bachelor degree from. Next, she received a master degree in economics from École Polytechnique and from the Paris School of Economics. Then she moved to the US to do a PhD, which she did at receiving her PhD in 2014, she moved to Harvard University, where she was appointed full professor only 4 years later. Only 4 years later. Stefanie's research is in the area of public finance, political economy, and macroeconomics. In her most recent research, she uses large-scale surveys and experiments to study how people understand and form their attitudes toward economic issues and policies. In her research, she has shown that many people's understanding and beliefs about the working of the economy are far from the consensus in economics. For instance, it turns out that many people believe that higher interest rates actually increase inflation rather than decrease it. Also, many people engage in what is called zero-sum thinking. This is the idea that whenever you see people trade or when you see a new policy, that there are winners and losers, and on net there's no gain. Gains and losses sum up to zero. Hence, zero-sum thinking. Now clearly, this contrasts sharply with the tradition in economics to not only study how to distribute the pie, but also, and in particular, how to enlarge the pie. We economists tend to be positive sum thinkers. Look at the world and at policymaking through the zero-sum thinking lens, you arrive at very different conclusions and judgments economists typically do. Indeed, you may end up voting for politicians who engage in zero-sum thinking themselves too. And we have witnessed that in a number of countries in the past decade. Understanding how people develop such zero-sum beliefs therefore seems most important today. And Stefanie's research has delivered key insights on this, and some of these insights she will share with us today. Professor Stefanie Stantcheva, thanks so much for being with us today. We are delighted that you will give the Tinbergen lecture this year. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to the conference organizers for this wonderful program. I'm incredibly excited, and I'm also reminded all the time that I'm in the Netherlands because I feel very short today. I would love to talk to you today about a set of papers, a set of recent research that is around the issue of how our perceptions, mindsets, and beliefs shape our policy views. And this is what we've done over the last few years at the Social Economics Lab at Harvard. Start with a bit of an organizing framework, a slide that shows you visually how I think about these issues in general, how these various aspects affect our policy views. So on this slide, you have policy views as the outcome. It's what's on top of the slide. Think of any policy here. We'll talk about climate change policies. We'll talk about taxation. We'll talk about policies to fight inflation. So this is the outcome. And what are the ingredients that go into someone's policy views? I've grouped them into first two big topics here. To the left, you have a very obvious one, especially to us economists, which is self-interest. It's this idea of how is a policy going to affect me or my household? How is it going to affect my budget? To a first order, we can imagine that people will support policies that are good for them. And that's definitely true. We'll see it as a recurrent theme in many of the policies we'll cover here. But it's not the full story. So to the right, there's this other box that I've called broader effects. So the broader effects are things which don't affect you directly, but that you might care about as a citizen. And here, we can split them into different aspects again. You have the perceived effectiveness or efficiency. What is the policy going to do, say, to labor supply? We have the perceived distributional impacts. Who will win, who will lose from a specific policy? We have fairness concerns. Think of fairness concerns as the weight you're going to put on winners versus losers and how you're going to assess that. And then we have views of government, which are another really important input potentially. Your general view of how competent, how trustworthy the government is going to matter potentially on top of all of this. At the bottom left here, I have another box, and this is something we'll talk about throughout, and that will be something that colors your whole perceptions, and this is mindsets. So what I mean by a mindset is, in addition to all these factors, it is like a lens, like a filter on your worldview. It is something that will very much color the way you view the world, the way you perceive your self-impact, the other broader impacts of a policy. It is something that will truly color your vision of reality. 2 example mindsets that I've listed here. First, partisanship. So it's something that will be coming back and back in all the papers I'll cover. And another one that I'll cover specifically at the end, and that Robert alluded to, is a zero-sum mindset. This idea that some groups, if they win, it must come at the expense of others. So those are 2 example mindsets that will very much taint your view of reality and the world. So keep this framework in mind, because as we go through various policies, we'll be discussing how these factors matter differently for each of them. A word on the method as well. The method that we use in these projects, and is something that we build on at the Social Economics Lab, are surveys and experiments. And I call them social economic surveys to distinguish them a little bit from other surveys we have out there. So we have 2 other types of surveys out there. One is long-standing, usually administrative surveys that we use to get statistics that we need, often unemployment, things about transfer receipts, many statistics. So for those things, sometimes we have better data now, for instance, through administrative data or other big data sources. And then we also have opinion polls. Think of before elections, people get asked about topics. So those are relatively superficial, usually, just asking people, do you support this or not? They're not going in depth by any means. And so in all these cases, there's things that remain invisible in data, no matter how great it is. And those invisible things are perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, reasoning. These are things which, unless you ask people more directly, we cannot usually get at. As economists, you know that we love our revealed preference approach, right? We love to be able to see what people do and from there infer what they believe. But this is not always possible for all topics, especially if we think about policy views. We're not often asked to vote on individual issues. We have no way of revealing our preferences, our reasoning, our beliefs with our behavior. So our revealed preference approach hits big limits here. And this is where this type of surveys that goes in depth into people's perceptions and reasoning can be incredibly useful. And so this is more than a measurement tool. It's something that seems incredibly important because you're controlling the data generating process. And so you're creating your own identifying variation, as we can say technically. You're basically producing the data that will help you answer your questions. So without further ado, let me jump into the first of 4 policy issues that I'll talk about. And let me start with tax policy. So tax policy is an area where this framework I just showed you is particularly polarized. What do I mean by that? I mean that for each of these boxes that I showed you, the perceived efficiency effects, the perceived distributional effects, all of these boxes will look very different depending on whether you're a left-leaning person or a right-leaning person. So I summarized this a little bit on this slide here, based on this project about how people understand taxes. So along all these factors, you will have very different perceptions. For instance, on efficiency effects of taxes. If you're someone who's more left-leaning, you will tend to think that taxes have smaller economic costs than someone who's right-leaning. You will think they affect savings less, labor supply less. Overall, there aren't that big distortions from taxes. On distribution effects, there will also be quite different perceptions. On the left, for instance, people will tend to think there is no such thing as trickle down. If you raise taxes on the rich, that is generally good for increasing revenues. It's not going to hurt lower income people. On the right, you will be much more likely to believe in this idea of trickle down. If you actually give tax cuts to richer people, it's going to be the tide that lifts all boats. This will be good for more people. And you can see this reflected in what topics people mention when they talk about taxes. So one thing that's incredibly useful in these surveys is to give people open-ended questions where they can freely write or talk about something without you priming them with specific answer options. So for instance, if you ask people a very broad question, what are your main considerations about the income tax? You can look at the answers and classify them into topics. So for instance, the first left panel shows you answers that fit in the distribution topic. What is distribution-related things? It's if people talk about inequality, if they talk about rich versus poor, if they talk about billionaires. So anything that is related to the income distribution and inequality. You see topics related to fairness, topics related to government spending, the social safety net. Sadly for us economists, efficiency is almost not mentioned. Efficiency, we don't expect people to mention the word, but it will cover things like hurt the economy, hurt labor supply, efficiency-related effects. So one thing we can see here related to this distribution topic is that it's one of the most prevalent ones. What people think about when they think about taxes tends to be a lot around inequality and distribution. And I've plotted here the share of responses that mentions distribution-related issues by political leaning. So based on the time the survey was done, the last election before that in the US was the 2016 one. So I've classified people between Clinton liberals, think about this as the most left-leaning respondents, all the way to Trump conservative voters, the most right-leaning respondents. And you can see this monotonic decline in the concern about distribution as you move from left to right. So distribution is one of the major topics people will be thinking about when they think about taxes. But they differ on the other dimensions too. On views of government, going back to this framework, there are very different views too. On the left, people will think that the government should have a broader scope and should be intervening to reduce inequality and improve equalities. On the right, people tend to think the government is not to be trusted as an institution, and so much more of this work should, for instance, move to the private sector and to markets rather than government. And then I've highlighted another part which is really important in these views about taxes, and this is reality. What do I mean by this? Isn't there just one reality? Well, not really if you think through the lens of your mindset. So what we see is what we've called the polarization of reality. And it's very apparent in the case of taxes, which is based on your political leaning, you're actually going to perceive different realities. Even things that you can easily Google or chat GPT today. For instance, what is the top tax rate today? Or what share of income goes to the top 1 or 10%? These things, the answers to these questions will differ systematically based on your political leaning. So this is why we call it the polarization of reality. So for instance, if you're someone who's on the left, you're going to think that taxes today are lower, not should be lower or higher. Rather, what they are today, you're going to think they're lower than someone on the right. You're going to think they're less progressive than someone on the right. You're going to think that inequality is higher and also has increased more than someone on the right. And obviously, this is interesting, but also perhaps somewhat worrying if the disagreements are not just about what should be done, but rather about things that, are facts or basic facts. But the most predictive, although all these factors differ, if you do a decomposition to try to see what ultimately drives people's views on taxation more, and you can confirm this with an experiment where you show people different information, what you see is that ultimately it's the fairness motives that differ most. So the perceptions about how fair the income distribution is, how much people deserve to keep their income or not, are going to be basically the major determinants. Far more important than, the efficiency effects you perceive, the cost of taxes you perceive. And let me dive into those fairness effects a little bit more because they are so important. So there's two types of tax policies we cover in this project. And I want to mention them both because, well, for one of them, the fairness concerns are pretty immediate and you won't be surprised at all. For the other, they might be a bit more interesting. And I know it's a debate in the Netherlands at the moment too. So the first tax policy is the income tax. And there, fairness concerns are pretty simple in the sense, if you think the income distribution is fair, if you think that, income is mainly due to your own effort, your own actions rather than to luck, if you think that people are entitled to keep their income, you're generally going to be pretty much against higher or progressive taxes. And we can see a very clear partisan split here along the dimensions you would expect, in the direction you would expect. So people on the left will tend to think all of these things are more unfair. People on the right will think they're much more fair. But the other tax policy is the estate tax. So this is similar to an inheritance tax, which is what I think is a big debate in many European countries, I think including the Netherlands. The way it works in the US is a little bit different just based on the tax base and who pays it. It is basically calculated on the total wealth of a deceased person, and part of that wealth gets taxed away before it is distributed to the different recipients. But think of it as a version of an inheritance tax. It's basically a tax on transmissions. So for that tax, the fairness concerns are quite thorny because if you ask people, take the perspective of children. Do you think it's fair that children from different families receive different inheritances, have different opportunities in life, are able to afford different housing, etc. because of that? Many people will say, no, it's not fair. I would actually like there to be more equal opportunities and a more level playing field. But then you ask people, okay, now take the perspective of parents, either parents who have themselves inherited or who have worked hard to provide for their children. Regardless of that, do you support parents being able to transfer this to their children tax-free? Many people will say, yes, I support that. And so there's a dilemma there. There's a trade-off. You cannot have it both ways. One of them is in tension with the other. And when you put people in front of that trade-off and say, on balance, if you had to take a stance, would you prefer letting parents pass on wealth tax-free, or rather have children have more unequal opportunities? There you see some partisan gaps, but it's much more nuanced now. So basically 50% of Democrats think, okay, let's let parents pass on their wealth free on balance. 70% of Republicans will say so. But it's no longer a unanimous view and a very strong view because there is that ethical tension. So the fairness concerns are much more nuanced here when it comes to a tax that involves both parents and children. And I think this is really important because we often talk about equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes as being two separate things, and that there's much more agreement on equality of opportunity. But when you think about it, the equality of outcomes of one generation become the equality of opportunity for the next one. So these things are almost intrinsically linked. So this is on tax policy. But let's look at some other policies and see if the same factors matter or if different things play a role. So the other policies that I wanted to cover is more generally climate policy. So this is based on work joined with many co-authors, some of them at the OECD, because it is a project that will cover a lot of countries. So we surveyed people in 20 countries, and the way we selected these countries is that they're major carbon emitters. So we basically have 18 of the 21 largest carbon emitters, and they cover together almost 3/4 of global CO2 emissions. The project is very much focused on climate change mitigation policies, not yet adaptation. This is why we sample countries that emit a lot rather than countries that are the biggest victims of climate change, which would be another very interesting project. So these countries are either high-income countries in lighter green on the map here, or middle-income countries in darker green. So we have a nice geographic representation, and we were very curious, why is it the case that some people support more climate action, others don't? What are ultimately the driving forces? And if you think back of our first slide of our little visual framework here, it could be that people worry about their self-interest, right? About the impacts on their household. It could be that people are worried about the efficiency effects of these policies on the economy. It could be that they're confused about their effectiveness or don't believe that they're effective. It could be that they worry about the distributional impacts. So all of these things could be important. So what is ultimately happening here? So one thing that we can actually get out of the way very quickly, which I show you on this slide, is this idea that there isn't a lot of support, or some people support more climate action than others just because they worry more about the environment. That doesn't seem to be the case. So on this figure, what you see is for each country, the share of people who says that climate change is an important problem, a serious problem, and that their country should take measures to fight climate change. So that's in blue versus green. So you have 2 bars for each country showing you the perception of the share of people who says that. You see that these shares are generally quite high. So today, perhaps unlike 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there is already a lot of awareness about climate change, and many people are already quite concerned. So it seems to a first order, it's not just a matter of some people are very worried, others are not. Okay, so what we do in the questionnaire to give you a bit more detail so you know where the results come from, people lots of background questions, and we'll use those to measure their self-interest. So things like natural things like education, income, political views, but also more detailed energy usage, consumption habits, which you could believe would affect their views on climate policy. Then something I'll talk about, we're going to provide them with different information. And this information will come in 3 flavors. So a control group will see no information whatsoever. One group that we call the climate impacts group is going to see a video explaining the effects of climate change as predicted by science on their country. So it's adapted to the country. For instance, in the US, we can expect more wildfires, more flooding on the coasts, in addition to general temperature rises. Another group will see the explanation of major climate policies. So they won't see anything about climate impacts, but they will get an explanation of the effectiveness, the distributional impacts of 3 major climate policies. So the way we pick them, they're listed below the box, is there's 3 major types of policies. One is regulation style policies. So here, as a placeholder, we picked a ban on combustion engine cars that's announced 10 years in advance, with progressively combustion engine cars being phased out. The other is a tax policy, specifically a carbon tax where the revenues are rebated cash to everybody. So this is something that was very much proposed in several countries and implemented in some places. And the third is an investment or infrastructure style policy. So we used a green infrastructure program financed by public debt. So the video goes in depth into those policies and explains how they work. Then the third group will see both videos together, so both the impacts and an explanation of the policies. And then people get asked lots of questions about the knowledge and understanding of climate change. I won't go into those in detail today, but it's variables we will use in predicting policy views. And then their views on climate policies, making a deep dive into those 3 main policies, eliciting people's perceptions of their effectiveness, their progressivity, the impacts on their households, and then scale in less detail their views on a lot of other related policies. And I'll show you a mega slide with a lot of different policies listed. So what explains support for climate policy? If we think about our framework, which of these boxes matter more? Well, for climate change, it turns out that there's three key things that matter. Three things are most predictive. If I know what you think about those, I can predict your support for climate change very well. The first is, unsurprisingly, the self-interest. So this one is very strong for climate. It wasn't very strong for income taxation, as you remember, but for climate, it is quite strong. So people worry whether the policies will financially hurt their household. And as a result of this, you'll see people's characteristics mattering a lot. So people, for instance, whose lifestyle allows them to adapt to climate policies, for instance, who don't rely on cars as much, who don't have high heating expenses, who live in areas with good public transportation, are going to be much more supportive of climate action. The second thing, perhaps also not as surprising, is the effectiveness belief. So how effective people think a policy is in reducing emissions is also going to matter a lot. But here's a case where there's quite a bit of disagreement too. Because imagine how difficult it is to predict the effectiveness of a given climate policy on temperatures or on climate change, right? If I say, if we put a 5% carbon tax, what's going to happen to temperatures? Wow, that is a long chain of events that I need to think through in order to get to that answer. And there is disagreement even among climate scientists, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's actually not easy to predict the effectiveness of these policies. And indeed, people are somewhat split on that. The third factor that matters, perhaps the most surprising here, is a strong equity concern. So above and beyond their own self-interest and how effective the policy is, people care about whether the policy is going to disproportionately hurt lower income or vulnerable households. So if they think the policy is regressive, they're not going to support it. And in fact, many of these policies are considered to be quite regressive. People tend to think that they will impact a lot lower income households, especially relative to richer households. What is perhaps also interesting is what's missing from this list. What is not actually that predictive of climate support. And one of the things is your specific knowledge. Remember, I told you we asked people quite a bit of knowledge questions about climate change. Your technical knowledge, so to speak, if you know which activities are more polluting, which sectors are more polluting, how much decarbonization is needed to stop temperatures from rising, all that is not very predictive of your support for policies. The other thing that's not predictive is your concern about climate change, your worries about it. And that you could already have guessed from the first slide I showed you on this paper, where we showed that a lot of people are already very concerned. So this is not something that moves people's views too much. Today, there's already quite a bit of generalized concern. So it's really these three factors that matter. And so let's look at this big slide that I promised you with a lot of different climate policies. And with these three factors in mind, let's see if we can interpret why some policies are more supported than others. So the way to read this slide is we have each country in a column, and I've split them into high-income countries to the left, middle-income countries to the right, with the averages for each group also represented. And then we have different policies in the rows. The policies are grouped by type or by topic. At the top, you have the three main policies, those that are covered in the videos, for instance, the Green Infrastructure Program, the ban on combustion engine cars, the carbon tax with cash transfers. Then we have policies related to transportation, for instance, banning polluting cars, but only in city centers. Energy policies, such as subsidies to low carbon technologies, tax on fossil fuels. Food-related, or I should say maybe agriculture-related policies, such as banning intensive cattle farming or putting a tax on cattle products that will double beef prices. And then support for a carbon tax, but with different uses of the revenues. So what will the revenues of that carbon tax be used for? Ranked here from most popular to least popular. The numbers in each cell show you the share of people in a given country that supports this policy. So the more blue, the higher the support, the more red, the lower the support. So a few things stand out and very much align with these three factors that we identified as being important. First, there's generally quite high support for low carbon technologies and infrastructure investment. So those policies tend to tick all the boxes. People don't think they're going to be hurt by them. They're financed by public debt in the baseline. They perceive them as being quite effective because they're directly linked to climate, and they don't worry about the distributional impacts as much. So those policies, in a sense, tick many of the boxes. On the other hand, carbon taxes, so the baseline here is a tax on fossil fuels, that is something that is not supported. And that might not come as a surprise, coming from France, thinking back to the Yellow Vest protest, to the Gilets jaunes, which was triggered by exactly such a proposal of a fuel tax, and one that would get rebated to everybody. So this is not popular at all. But the use of the revenue matters hugely. So this is very much in line with the effectiveness and the equity concern. Either the revenues can be used specifically for climate purposes, so for instance, funding environmental infrastructures or subsidizing low-carb technologies. In that case, it has much, much higher support and quite high support. Or they can be used in more progressive ways. So for instance, reducing the personal income taxes, which are progressive, in a progressive way. So as a result of that, the policy starts to become more equitable in people's minds, more progressive, rather than the baseline, which is considered really regressive. So this is a way to, the use of the revenues is really critical. I don't show you some of the variations here, but obviously for taxes, the use of revenues matters. For subsidy policies or infrastructure, the source of the funds matters, right? How are you going to finance it? That's the flip side. You see a similar pattern there where, financing it with public debt or financing it by progressive taxes, say on disproportionately on higher income, is considered much better than financing it through, more general taxes or less progressive ways. So the flip side is on the spending policies, on the source of the revenues. You can also see, I don't have a box to show it, but where you see a lot of red and orange is on the agriculture-related policies. So many countries are really opposed to policies that tinker with the agriculture. That is something that is not in people's line of support at all. Another thing I want to end on here, in terms of who supports this action, before I turn to the experimental effects, is within country, you can also identify specific groups of people who are more supportive of climate policy. So within country now, the first thing we already discussed, which is related to the self-interest, people whose lifestyle allows them to are going to be more supportive. The biggest proxies are having access to high-quality public transportation, relying less on a car, and having lower gas expenses. Those are going to be very predictive of your self-interest and hence your support. Beyond that, being left-leaning, again, think of the mindsets, right? Being left-leaning in all countries is going to be associated with higher support of climate policies as well. Of course, in different countries, the parties are different, but if you classify them on a left to right spectrum, as comparable as possible, you see this pattern. Those with higher levels of education, particularly college education, are also going to be much more supportive. And in fact, that swamps any effect of income. So income per se, obviously correlated with education, but doesn't matter as much as education. And then age has mixed effects. We were walking today with Robert briefly. I saw something that makes this point. There were people distributing pamphlets from the party Grandparents for the Environment or something like that I translated. This speaks very much to this fact, which is that contrary to our intuition, perhaps, age doesn't have a clear effect. In some countries like the US, France, and Australia, younger people are very much more supportive of climate policies, but in general, in other countries, it's insignificant. So it is not the case that this is just a young people concern by any means. Now let me turn to the video impacts. If you still remember from the questionnaire slide, we show people these different videos, either explaining the impacts of climate change or the policies. So what do we find here? What we find is that showing people the climate impacts shifts their policy views, but only by a little. Why is that? Well, they increase the concerns about climate change to some extent, and they increase your exact knowledge about the impacts of climate change. But as we just saw, those are not very predictive factors of your policy views. So in a sense, making people more worried about climate change is not really the way to go if you're trying to increase climate support. That's already perhaps a given today. So this is not the margin on which you're going to move people. On the other hand, the video showing the impacts of climate policies and also the combined treatment as a result, that shifts policy views by a lot. That has significant impact. And the reason is that they shift exactly those beliefs that are most predictive of policy views, namely the perceived impact on yourself and on others and the effectiveness of the policy. And the videos are by no means all rosy. They don't just say, oh, these are great policies and everything's wonderful. They do explain some winners and losers, etc., but they explain the policies clearly. And that shifts people's views quite a bit. And not just on those policies that are covered by the video, but also on related policies that are similar. And so this is something that we took away from this project, that explaining how these policies work and who benefits or how losers can be compensated, for instance, with a carbon tax, rebating the revenues to people is some form of compensation that can really be critical to fostering policy support. So this is, at least for climate policy, the way to go, rather than just making people more worried about climate change. And I don't have it on the slide, but another, if you want, policy conclusion that comes out of this, if you think about this strong role of self-interest, is that it's going to be really crucial to make self-interest work in the policy's favor. What I mean by this is the sequencing, the order of policies is really important. If you think about first implementing policies that help households adapt, such as subsidies for improving their home infrastructure, or getting electric vehicles, or making sure the infrastructure is there to be using electric vehicles, before having carbon taxes, before having taxes on polluting vehicles, that sequencing is going to be really critical to first allow people to adapt and let the self-interest play in favor rather than against the policy support. So this is on climate change, as you see, quite a bit different from tax policy. So let's move to the third policy. I'll call this broadly policies to fight inflation. So this will have a different set of findings as well. So it's based on two papers, trying to understand people's understanding of inflation and particularly why we dislike inflation so much. So inflation has been coming back in the news in many countries after a period of really, really low inflation. And so it's interesting to know what people think about this. So let me start with the self-interest part, okay, that box that seems important. So if you ask people in an open-ended way, hence the 3 dots, the most important impact of inflation in my life has been, and you do a topic analysis on the answers to classify them in topics. So bear in mind, this is people talking freely. So these are not answer options that I've provided them with. And you can plot the answers by topic and by income group. So here we have below 40K, above 125K. So basically the lowest tercile, the highest tercile in the sample, and then the average in the full sample in gray. You see very strongly it's things about purchasing power and living standards that are at the top. So people mentioned the increased cost of living in general, specifically harder to afford food, harder to afford gas, spending habits, housing, bills. So mainly the topics are about purchasing power and living standards. And indeed, this is what we see. People believe that although inflation for economists might be just a measurement issue, right, just a yardstick, and eventually wages rise with prices, this is not at all people's perceptions. They think that their wages will take a long time to catch up, and so inflation very much reduces their living standard. Beyond that, they also have these broader concerns that we saw on the first slide. So it's not just about themselves. When you ask people, what are perceived consequences of inflation? How important are these to you? Please select your top consequence. You can see here I've grouped them into political and social costs that people might perceive, things like increasing inequality, decreasing social cohesion, which are somewhat important, efficiency and economic costs, things like slowing down GDP growth, increasing resource misallocation. What does that mean? These are basically our econ models, right? We think about inflation, changing relative prices in a disorganized way, so causing resource misallocation, or forcing households to have cash on hand, making price setting harder. These are the economic effects we're thinking about. And then at the bottom, cognitive costs, like making household decisions more complex, increasing household uncertainty. So you see that people do perceive quite a bit of overall consequences. But again, this idea of making household decisions more complicated, both because their budget set is tighter and because it requires them to constantly redo their budget, is a very, very salient consequence. What about the distributional consequences? Remember, that's another key box in our framework. What do people think about the distributional consequences? So these graphs I'm showing you by political leaning. Sometimes there is a bit of a gap, sometimes there isn't. You can also see them by income, and they're very similar. So the way to read this graph is I'm asking people, to what extent do you think these groups are going to be hurt by inflation? So at the top, you have groups by income. So do you think low-income people will be hurt, middle-income people, high-income people? You see that the distributional consequences are generally perceived to be quite negative, that low-income people and the middle class are going to be much more hurt than high-income people. There's some other interesting things here, particularly the lack of patterns. If you ask people by age, do you think younger people or older people will be more hurt? People don't perceive a difference between these groups, even though economic theory does suggest there will be some age effects based on people who have more savings versus people who consume more. By employment, there also isn't much effect. There is some effect by savings, where people actually think that those with no savings, probably because they think they're just lower income overall, will be more hurt than those who have financial assets or those who have cash savings. So pretty adverse distributional consequences here. And this feeds into people's views about fairness. So let me show it on this slide here, which is, if you ask people, if inflation doubled, how long until your wage doubles? Many people think it's going to take quite a while. So, people are going to be hurt in their living standard. But look at the bottom rows here, which ask you to compare how long it takes for you relative to how long it takes for others. And specifically, if you ask people, do the wages of higher income people rise more quickly than yours? Many, many people will say yes. So there is that notion that those who are well off are going to be much better able to keep pace with prices than me. If you ask them, do the wages of other people in general rise more quickly than mine? Much less so. So it's not about just the systematic bias between you and others. It's really about how you perceive high-income people will fare. So the fairness aspects of this are clearly pretty negative in people's minds. And you can also see it in this chart here, which is asking people how they felt. Okay. Yes, you can take a photo. It is very... So if you ask people, I should preface this by saying, if you just do a pure emotion analysis word cloud, so if you ask people, when I went to the store and I saw that prices were higher, I felt what emotion? And it comes out mostly as anger, followed by fear and stress, so very negative emotions that are triggered by inflation and the sense of inequity. And then the follow-up question is, since anger is the most dominant, who do you feel angry at? And you can see very clearly the government appears. At that time it was Joe Biden, so his name appears as well very, very clearly. But in general, you see policy, politicians, the government, also pretty big corporations. So what you'll see in the data is that many, many people blame the government, and this is regardless of their political leaning, even though you tend to blame the government more if it's not your party in power. And in the US, there are just two parties effectively, so you will blame the opposition. But many people also blame corporations and businesses. So there's this idea of greedflation. I don't know if you've heard that term, but the idea that, you know, companies are just increasing their profits by raising prices. And this, if you dig deeper into the perceived causes of inflation, you basically confirm that it's either about increases in the cost of production due to COVID, due to the disruption in supply chains, or really government spending, debt, taxation that are the key. I want to show you this also related to the role of companies, because this feeds into the perceived unfairness of inflation. Here, the question might be a little bit unusual to you, and it's because I've taken it verbatim from a survey that Robert Shiller did in 1996, asking people things about inflation with a pretty small-scale mail survey, but I wanted to compare it to back then. And he asked exactly this question, which is, essentially, what is people's theories about inflation and wages? How do they think wages adjust to inflation? And the categories here are either, well, inflation will increase my employer profits and they will not feel any need to increase my pay. The idea of greedflation. So this is the most stood behind view of respondents. This is the theory they believe most in, as opposed to inflation will increase competition among companies. It will lead my employer to raise my wage to just match, you know, other offers, or a sense of fairness and proper behavior will cause my employer to raise my pay. Also not a very popular view. So you see that people in general tend to think that employers have a lot of discretion, firms have a lot of discretion. So if their wage is not increasing, it's because their employer chooses not to. They're feeding into this sense of unfairness, you know, inequity coming from inflation. As a result of this, what types of policies do people support? Because there are many different types of inflation fighting policies. So the way I've grouped them here is, at the top, we have the very standard monetary policy tools, like increasing interest rates and decreasing interest rates. And Robert alluded to this. I've put this in here because many people do believe that higher interest rates cause higher inflation. And you see here that a lot of people support decreasing interest rates as a way to fight inflation. So this might seem strange to us, but I think it's important to always think, where do these views come from, right? Why is it the case that this is out there? I think there's two reasons. One is that it's hard to distinguish correlation and causality, right? What do you see in periods of high inflation? You typically see rising interest rates. And so it is not easy to say what's the cause, what's the correlation here. The other reason is that people consider interest rates to be part of their cost of living, right? Interest rates will increase, loan costs will increase, mortgage costs. These are things that people consider to be part of their cost of living. And so it is not crazy to think, oh, this means for me a price rise, an increase in the costs I have to pay to get a car, on an auto loan, to get a consumer loan, or to get a house. So what you see on this graph, you know, we have the standard monetary policy tools, we have reductions in government debt financed by different cuts or different taxes, and then we have other policies. Let's talk about those in a second. So standard monetary policy tools, not super by any means. The one that has the highest support is basically decreasing interest rates. Reductions in government debt is quite supported because of this idea that government is the main source and government spending is a main source of inflation. And specifically, think of the progressivity and equity concern. People tend to support it with progressive taxes, so increasing taxes on higher incomes. Of course, there's a partisan gap here, but the baseline support for that is pretty high. So the equity concern pops out here, rather than, for instance, decreasing social programs, cutting spending on social programs. And then let's look at these other policies. So these are, I call them other because they're not necessarily the standard policies we think about when we think about inflation, but they speak to this concern that it might be companies. So for instance, tightening antitrust regulation, increasing taxes on high incomes, increasing corporate taxes, those have pretty high support, again, with some partisan gap. And then the freezing the prices of essentials is something that was suggested quite a bit in many countries during the big bout of inflation, and that has quite a bit of bipartisan support. Let me speed over trade policy. It's a very big topic, and we have a lot of results on this, but I'll basically summarize for you the sort of 3 key findings, again, keeping this framework in mind. So for trade policy, let me just pop up a slide that will show you that same framework, but with a small modification. Basically, similar to what we saw before, we have what shapes your views on trade policies, but in the self-interest box, I've now made 2 columns. Because what's special about trade policy is that it affects us as both consumers and workers, right? We are affected either from the goods we buy, the prices, the variety, but as workers, we're affected through our sector, how threatened our jobs are or not. And so we have these 2 roles that will shape our self-interest. So keep that in mind when we talk about trade policy. So what will ultimately drive people's support for trade policy? The first thing we see is that the perceived job risks will matter much more for policy views than potential consumer gains. So what does econ theory predict? It predicts that the gains from trade for consumers will be quite widespread, right? They will be diffuse. Everybody will gain by a little. So this is very much how people perceive this. If you ask them, has trade decreased the prices of goods you buy? Is it lower because we have trade? It's a bit less than 50-50. So people are not super convinced about the price impacts of trade. And this is because it's so hard to imagine the counterfactual, right? What is a world without trade? It's so hard to imagine what prices would be like. So people don't quite appreciate the consumer gains from trade. Very much in line with econ theory. On the other hand, the theory also predicts that the losses from trade will be very acute and very concentrated in some sectors for some people. And this is again how people perceive it. Very few people feel directly threatened in their job. But if you prime them to think about threats to their job, that will generate a big effect on their trade policy views. So if you ask them to think about gains as consumers, there will not be any movement on policy views. If you ask them to think about threats to your job, potential threats to your job from this, there will be. So the conclusion here is that perceived job risks matter much more than potential consumer gains. The other big finding is about what matters more. Is it the efficiency effects of trade, or is it the distributional or equity concerns that people have about it? And it turns out both matter. People care both about the broader efficiency aspects and the distributional consequences, but they're going to affect different aspects of trade policy. So many people will believe that trade will lead to efficiency gains in the form of higher competitiveness, innovation, and growth. They also understand that trade will have adverse distributional consequences. For instance, many people believe that the biggest winners from trade will be large corporations or high-income households. And there's much more pessimism about how the average worker or lower-income people or small businesses will be affected. These will affect different parts of trade policy. If you believe trade has good efficiency effects, you're going to support less trade restrictions, less tariffs, less restrictions on the flow of goods and services. If you believe that there's distributional aspects of trade, you're not necessarily going to be anti-free trade, but you're going to support a lot more compensatory redistribution, by which I mean policies that help the losers from trade handle their losses. Things like direct assistance, direct cash transfers, or retraining programs, or sectoral programs. So there's that distinction. The belief in the efficiency effects of trade is going to improve your support for open trade. Your worries about the equity is going to really affect your wish to have more compensatory redistribution, not necessarily a backlash against free trade. But this also says that these 2 facets of trade policy, the trade barriers and the redistribution aspect, really go hand in hand. And if you don't want to lose support for free trade, you need to have both. You can't abandon the redistribution aspect, because this is something that does matter quite a bit for people. So if you want to support free trade to be maintained, you need to do that redistribution part as well. I'll skip the third thing, or I'll cover it super quickly, which is basically just the self-interest part for trade matters a lot too. In a sense, if you're someone who's been affected by trade because you're in a local labor market that's very threatened, or because you're in an import competing sector, or in a competition facing sector with abroad, you're going to have much worse views on trade. And what I was trying to say on this slide is that it's going to color not just your support for trade, but as a mindset, it's going to matter for your broader perceived impacts of trade, the distributional, the efficiency aspects, all of it is going to be colored by your own experience. And to finish in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk about this other mindset that we haven't covered yet, which is zero-sum thinking. So we talked a lot about partisanship. What about zero-sum thinking? So zero-sum thinking is this belief that if you or a group of people gains, it must come at the expense of others. So the world is a fixed pie. If you get a larger slice of the pie, I must be getting a smaller slice of the pie. It's in contrast to a positive-sum mindset where we could all be made better off. So the way we ask people about their zero-sum thinking is to ask them about different domains. We don't want just a domain-specific view because that could be, colored by other beliefs. Instead, we want your general tendency to think in zero-sum terms. So we're going to ask people the extent to which they believe interactions between different groups are zero-sum. And the different groups are going to be between ethnic groups, for instance, between black versus white versus other groups, immigrants and non-immigrants, between countries when they trade, or between income groups. And when we have your views on how zero-sum these interactions are, we can construct an index of your general tendency to think in zero-sum terms. So what do we see? Well, here's some facts about who's more zero-sum. So first, you see that at the top left, the higher the more zero-sum people are. So people in urban areas are much more zero-sum than people in rural areas. Many possible explanations. It could be a treatment effect, like there's more competition for jobs, potentially for housing, right? So this could be making you more zero-sum. Education is really interesting. I'm sorry, this is not good news for any of us here in this room, I think. But initially, your zero-sum thinking declines with education, but get into the high degrees like postgraduate, it is increasing. So it could be a selection effect. Maybe we all are very zero-sum and we select into these fields. Or it could be a treatment effect. All these very competitive fields and limited slots, etc., make us more zero-sum. We don't know, but that pattern is there. Income also has this sort of non-monotone shape where initially you become less zero-sum and then you become more zero-sum again at higher income levels. But this is perhaps two most interesting patterns, which is by political leaning. So if you plot the whole distribution of the index by political party, what you will see is that it is not a partisan issue. So unlike so many other things I just showed you, it is not the case that one side is more zero-sum than the other. In the general tendency to think zero-sum, it's pretty evenly distributed. And so as a result, when I show you the policy views this entails, you might be a little surprised because it's unusual to see this mix of policy views. And it's because it picks from both sides of the political spectrum. It is something that explains a lot of within-party variation in views rather than across party. And then seeing the average age in this room, this might be bad news too, which is that younger generations are more zero-sum as well. And by the way, when I say bad news, I'm saying it half jokingly because we're not taking a stance on how zero-sum situations actually are. And obviously, many situations are zero-sum, so it depends on the short run versus long run, etc. But in terms of perceptions, younger generations are much more zero-sum than older generations. And you might wonder if this is an age effect or a cohort effect. And it turns out, because you can look at many different countries, it is a cohort effect. It is a generational effect. And in fact, it's very related to the economic circumstances you grow up in. So if I overlay this chart with growth in the bottom 50% income, so the more generalized growth that people have experienced in the first 20 years of their life, it has the cross pattern. So it's basically a mirror image of this chart. And in the paper, we match it more carefully also to your own family's experiences. So if your family has experienced upward mobility, you're less zero-sum. If they have immigration history, which in general is associated with higher mobility, good economic outcomes, you're also less zero-sum. And so these micro and macroeconomic experiences seem to really matter. What happens on policy views? How is this related to policy views? As I told you, it picks from both sides of the political spectrum. So I'll put up the figure, which is giving you all the details, but I'll tell you the results verbally, and they're also summarized in the title slide, which is we ask people about lots of policy views, and we organize them in 4 types of policies: pro-redistribution policy, race attitude policies, which are increasing the more affirmative action or equality across race policies you want, a gender equality policy, and then anti-immigration policies. And zero-sum thinking will shift all of these in the positive direction, the way they're defined here. So it's going to make you more supportive of redistribution, with this idea that if you think that the rich are gaining at the expense of the poor, you want the government to step in and do something about it with redistribution. You want to help correct this negative externality. Similarly, you want more intervention to ensure gender and race equality, because you want the correction for that externality that the advantaged group is imposing on the disadvantaged group. And that's also going to be correlated with more restrictive immigration policies, with this idea that if immigrants are hurting non-immigrants, if their gains come at the expense of non-immigrants, you want the government to step in and stop that. So you see, it's not a clearly left or right-leaning mindset. It picks from both, with this general idea that if you view the world in zero-sum terms, you want to do something to help the group that's being hurt. Of course, your self-interest will play a role too here, and will moderate this depending on if you're part of the group gaining or not from the zero-sum interaction, but that general pattern is very much there. And so this is something that I think is quite important to continue looking at, because many situations in the world are zero-sum, and the role of policy is to push towards non-zero-sum situations. Policy can make the world more zero-sum or not. You know, if we think about more win-win policies, things like education, healthcare investments, policies that help children come to mind as being more win-win, innovation policies, all of these can create, grow the pie. And so I think for policy, it's incredibly important to take this mindset seriously and think about how to change the world. As I alluded to, what we show in this paper is that it is very much correlated to your reality, what you have experienced and what your family has experienced. So it is not something that is just a bias by any means. It is something that is deeply rooted in people's reality and history. And so when we think about should the mindset be changed, well, it is reflecting people's reality. So that is really the part, to work on. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of an overview of projects can be done this way and what shapes people's policy views. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. This was a wonderful lecture. We're on a quite tight schedule because the next break is actually quite short.
I'll talk
so
very
we have
fast.
we have about 14 minutes left. And of course, this also should include a handout of a traditional present that we have for you. So let's open the floor for questions from your side. Yes, over there.
Thank you so much. I'll try to speed up as well. I really like your slide on the different climate policies. I wonder, you talked about, fairness being a concern, distributional impacts being a concern. I wonder why, therefore, the carbon tax plus cash transfer revenue recycling is not, why there's not a lot of support for that. Is it a revenue recycling effectiveness perception issue? And then on the zero-sum part, I think a recurring theme is competition and attitudes towards competition and how we feel about competition. You talked about the treatment effect, people being in these really competitive industries and therefore viewing the world as zero-sum. Or with the low income mobility, there's more competition for resources, therefore. So I wonder how you could relate that to attitudes towards competition. Thank you. Sorry.
So I'll speak very fast, and the answer is even faster than I spoke during the talk. So for the carbon tax with cash transfers, it is actually one of the policies that was proposed, and the Gilets jaunes was sort of a reaction to that type of policy. And the reason is people consider it to be regressive. In this case, it is a misperception, because in isolation, that policy, if you rebate the revenues lump sum to everybody, is going to be progressive. And so this is something that people actually realize in the video, that is useful information conveyed there to explain that progressivity, and that's why it increases support. The zero-sum thinking, yes, you can see that other things like the mobility that's happening, the opportunities, there's measures of this at the macro level, also at the individual level, play a big role. So it does suggest that the competition you've experienced or the opportunities you've experienced are really pivotal and shape that quite a lot.
Okay, so on your zero-sum thinking part, you show that people in a rural setting have something like 0.5 from a 0 to 1 scale, people in the urban setting 0.57. What does that actually mean?
Great. Yes. I didn't spend too much time on the magnitudes, and per se the index is not interpretable. So one thing you can just think about is that a big change in terms of standard deviation? It's somewhat like one standard deviation. So it is a pretty big gap between urban and rural, or between, say, the youngest and the oldest. So these are pretty sizable differences. You can also think about how the policy views will differ. You can benchmark it to that, and it will basically imply that, for instance, support for anti-immigration policies based on this gap will be much larger for the urban. So they're like significant magnitudes, also economically significant.
Along the same line, you now more or less close off the answer models to these 5 options. Well, before you argued you should use open questions where possible. There is also the growing the pie view of the world. Did you measure that too, and does it have a similar effect?
A growing what view of the world?
Growing the pie rather than zero sum. If you ask people the same question about, do you believe that we can grow the pie rather than be in conflict this way? Do you agree on this 5-point scale? Did you try that? Does it have a similar effect?
I'm so sorry that I can't understand the policy.
Yeah, I think the question is, did you also ask questions about whether people believe in positive sum thinking?
Got it. So the way to interpret this question, the way we ask them is, it's either, if they say yes, it's either zero or negative sum, and the flip one is positive sum. So if someone disagrees that the gains come at the expense of others, they are positive sum. So it's the complement here. So it's zero and negative together or positive. And so for instance here, you can interpret this directly as, among the older generations, many more think in positive sum terms. It's the contrary, basically. So this is an index, it's not a share, so we didn't classify people into a binary, zero sum or not, because, but you can just get that out from the paper as well. It depends on the domain, because for the domain, per domain you can look at the share. Here it's an index grouping all domains together.
I was wondering, as I understand it correctly, a lot of the research been done in the United States, and for the past few years I also believe that zero-sum game thinking has been quite prominent in politics, with phrases like China's ripping us off, or they're stealing our jobs, or the immigrants are taking the jobs. So I was wondering, what is your opinion on the cause and the effect? Is it politicians influencing people's beliefs on the zero-sum game thinking on either side of the spectrum, or is it politicians playing into already existing beliefs of people about zero-sum games?
So two answers. One is that we actually have data on more countries here, and when I tell you that the younger generations being more zero-sum is a generational effect, obviously I couldn't make that statement if it was just one country, one-time series. So this is pooling many countries together, and you see that same pattern in most rich countries, so the Netherlands, France, Germany. And you see the reverse image in developing countries or emerging markets, where things used to be worse in terms of growth and mobility are better today. So there you see the younger generations being less zero-sum than the older ones. So it is not just the US statement. Second, as you see, it's not a partisan issue. And so in that sense, it is very much tied to people's own experiences. So in the paper, we map it to these three key experiences people can have: mobility, immigration, important for the US, race and enslavement history, and they do matter a lot. They're very predictive. So it is people's reality. Then whether this gets exploited by policymakers or not is an open open avenue for research. But what we took away from is it is very much rooted in what people have experienced.
Hi, thank you. My name is Laurens. I work for the Dutch Ministry of Finance. And I think often I work on the budget myself, and we have this understanding of, or this question, do people really intuitively and unprimed understand the communication between expenditures and taxes? And do they trust the system? And do they understand that raising taxes allows for more expenditures and raising expenditures requires more taxes? Or do they see the government as a sort of sheriff of Nottingham, which just takes, and there's no real relationship between these two?
Yeah, great question in two ways. So first, question is, when we ask people these questions, are we making sure that they do have a budget constraint in mind? Because if you just say, oh, do you want to increase spending on this without any budget constraint or what's going to be cut, obviously it's going to matter. I showed you this for climate. If you have revenues from a tax, how they're going to be spent is going to, there is not this separability in people's minds. So we always try to be careful about specifying, what has to be cut, or if we have to select spending on different programs, you have to hit a budget constraint. You have to hit 100%. You can't go over. So that's very important for just the survey methodology and trusting these answers. The second thing is that people don't quite trust the government, right, to spend the revenue. We see this for the climate change paper, which is if the policy is earmarked, the revenues are earmarked to go towards environmental purposes, that is much more supported. It does imply that people don't trust the government to direct it to those sources, right? So if it gets plugged back into the general revenue, you see people don't support it as much at all. They don't like or trust the way it's going to be spent. So this speaks in the direction of this, lack of trust or disagreement with how the money is going to be spent.
I have a question on tariffs. I think it's very remarkable that it's in the US it's very hard to raise taxes, but if you put in a trade tariff with the same effect, it seems that there's a lot of more political support for it, because in the end people have to pay it. So I wonder what's your view on that in terms of zero-sum thinking.
So first, on the support of tariffs, it's not. I've been running a survey since the situation started, just to see, how people understand it, if the views change over time, and there isn't a broad support for it. It's something that is very politically polarized, but overall, people are actually quite worried about their household and the price impact. So it's not a unanimous support by any means. However, the other thing I want to point out is what I showed you here on this paper, which is it is hard for people to understand the price effects of trade. It's something that is difficult to imagine, the counterfactual. What will happen if we don't import that good? Or if we imported more or less of it, is production going to shift? What's going to happen to the prices? It's hard to imagine, and that translates into tariffs, where not everybody says tariffs will increase the prices of the goods. So it is not perceived as unanimously consistent with this difficulty of assessing the impacts of trade on prices.
I want to go back to something you said a few questions ago. I was interested in the fact that the most support for the redistribution from carbon taxes seems to be for these like green spending programs, so on renewable technologies. And so I've heard you say that is related to like those spending patterns not harming consumers in any way. How much of it do you think is also related to the fact that it's more Pigouvian, right? So it's sort of more targeted directly towards the opposite of the externality that's taxing?
Terrific. And hopefully I said both in the talk, but if not, you're right to correct me, because yes, it ticks both boxes. One is that it is considered to be in line with the equity concern, but the other is it makes the policy more effective in people's minds, which is another of the key three concerns that people might have. So, and as I just answered there as well, people don't trust the government to spend it if you just put it back into the general budget. And so this earmarking of the revenues to a specific environmental cause seems very useful.
Okay, the final question.
Well, first of all, thank you for a fantastic lecture. I was wondering if you would have the objective to align people's policy views with the scientific consensus on whatever topic. Which of the elements in your framework would you target? So which is the most promising to align people?
That's a really great and broad question to end on. We see in this talk, for different policies, different things matter more. you know, whether it's the self-interest, the fairness concerns, the distributional impact. So different things matter more. That being said, you know, for us economists, I think our job is to estimate the effects of that we perceive the policies to have: distributional impact, effectiveness, and you see that's sort of the messages from these papers too. Providing information on those things can be effective too. We can't necessarily tell people, or shouldn't tell people, oh, what should you consider to be fair or not. That's not a part that we need to tinker with, but we have so much value added to convey the effects of it, the distributional effects, the perceived effectiveness effect. And for policies, including the climate change ones I showed you, that is quite effective if people understand the policies better, and we can explain how they actually work. Yeah.
All right. Well, then it's time to hand out our traditional present. And maybe you will recognize it because several of your colleagues have the same one.
I've
Well,
seen
not
it in their
exactly the
offices.
same, but last year, Paul Antres gave the Tinbergen lecture and he promised to put it on the wall in his office. So maybe you have seen it already.
We'll go check and report back. No, I've been very envious, so I'm very glad to get my own.
Wonderful. Stefanie, thank you once more for a wonderful lecture and for engaging with us on
Thank you all so much.
Very much.